Hey everyone, welcome back. The Florida State Board of Education just released their academic standards for teaching African American history, and they are, in a word, racist. As a matter of fact, some of them draw directly from white supremacist talking points. My personal favorite being that students should learn, quote, how slaves developed skills which, in some instances, could be applied for their personal benefit. Now, there are a number of other examples, and I do encourage you to go read through it on your own. Because while we could do a video where we break down all of these standards and show the different dog whistles and other coded language that refers to pro-slavery, pro-segregation, and more broadly white supremacist talking points, but instead I'd like to do something that's a little bit more fun and hopefully a little bit more constructive. We're going to delve into the realm of malicious compliance and hopefully give some Florida educators a little bit of inspiration as to how they could comply with the letter of these standards while still giving their students a thorough and accurate education in African American history. Now, we're going to start off with the academic standards for the youngest students and work our way up. So starting off with K through 4, these students are expected to identify and recognize significant African American historical figures. Now, to the average person, that sounds pretty reasonable, You would expect that someone who looks at a picture of Frederick Douglass would know who he is and what he did. But here's the thing that educators know, but the rest of us aren't really aware of, is that academic standards are written almost painfully literally. So what this standard actually says is that all these kids are expected to do is to be able to see that picture of Frederick Douglass and know that his name is Frederick Douglass. There's no actual requirement that they know anything about his life or what he accomplished. I know it's a little bit of a nitpicky thing, but given all the things students are expected to learn and teachers are expected to teach over the course of an academic year, they really have to be careful about how they allocate their time. And so by putting the bar on the floor, the Florida State Board of Education is giving some teachers the leeway to simply ignore the accomplishments of these African American historical figures. Now, of course, the easy fix here is that the teachers can go above the standard, and I know a lot of really great teachers are always going above and beyond anyway, so I'm sure that they will be able to add in those historical lessons. For instance, say, Harriet Tubman was responsible for helping with the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass was a profound speaker in the abolitionist movement, etc. And these are, I know, little things, but they're also little kids. And so these are the concepts that they probably should be learning when it comes to African American history, but they're things that are being left out of the standards as set by the Florida State Board of Education. Now we're going to move on from elementary school to middle school, where we run into that standard that I quoted at the start of this video. The one where students have to be taught that slaves learned a number of valuable skills while they were enslaved on the plantations, which they could then use to their personal benefit once they were free. Now, I don't think we have to go too in-depth as to how this standard mirrors the white supremacist talking point that Western culture civilized the African American. So instead, let's jump right back to our malicious compliance and talk about how the standard can actually be used to make a pretty elegant transition between slavery and Jim Crow. Yes, it is technically correct that while they were working on the plantations in horrific conditions, there were some slaves who probably picked up a lot of skills when it came to farming, especially related to the important crops of the South. Additionally, some were selected to learn skilled trades such as blacksmithing. However, once the war was over and the Reconstruction period ended, Southern politicians wasted no time in implementing what we now know as Jim Crow laws, which effectively made it impossible for newly freed slaves to actually use any skills they might have gained to their personal benefit. And then you can lead that into a discussion of why African Americans moved north into different cities in the north like Detroit and Chicago. Talk about issues that arose with sharecropping and how a lot of these factors ended up laying the foundation for segregation and, more broadly, systemic racism. You're not going to get into all of the nuance at this level, but you can still start to have those basic discussions that, yes, slavery made things unequal, and sure, there was an opportunity in the post-slavery period during Reconstruction that maybe African Americans could have improved their station. There were a number of African American politicians at that time. African American men were able to vote pretty regularly, but as soon as Reconstruction ended, all of that went away. All of that progress was lost due to the racist policies implemented by a majority of Southern politicians. And that's how we got to issues like Jim Crow and segregation. And you can think about how that might have impacted people going forward and their ability to make a living for themselves. Again, we met the standard. We told students that slaves may have learned some skills that could have helped them, but now we also told them why they couldn't actually use those skills to actually make their lives better. Next, we move on to junior high and high school, where students are starting to learn about some of the bloodier elements of African American history, such as lynch mobs and race massacres like those perpetrated at Okeechobee, Rosewood, and Tulsa. Now, the standard set forth by the Florida State Board of Education requires that students be taught about violence perpetrated against and by African Americans. Now, anyone who's done even a cursory overview of this historical time period would know that there's not really a lot of systemic violence being committed by African Americans against the powers that be. And that's because offering any kind of physical resistance when the system is so stacked against you was a great way to guarantee a horrific fate for both you and your family at the hands of an angry mob. So there's really not a lot of historical evidence to even support this standard. However, the question we're here to answer is, how do we maliciously comply with that standard? And I suppose there is one type of violence that was perpetrated by African Americans that we can talk about. Now, it didn't actually happen, but it was a narrative being pushed by crackpot scientists and Southern politicians in order to justify racist policies such as Jim Crow. And a lot of it boiled down to the scary black man stereotype. These people would come out and say that African American males are these hulking, unintelligent, violent creatures with, more often than not, an unnatural and unquenchable lust for white women, and that these policies they were implementing were necessary to protect the purity of white Southernhood. Now, of course, all of this was absolute nonsense. I could use stronger language, but we're a family-friendly channel. A lot of the data was fabricated, and mostly people were just leaning into their own confirmation bias and their own racism and bigotry. And what was worse is that they would then use these narratives to whip people up, and that's how you would end up getting lynch mobs or some of the race massacres like we discussed earlier in this video. And this is a teachable moment where you can say that a false narrative that was pushed by people in power led to other people committing acts of heinous violence that they might not have otherwise committed had people been honest with them. And I'm sure we can think of a couple places where we can draw some historical parallels, let's say. Maybe to a certain event in January 2021. Now, we could go through more examples, but at the end of the day, the main takeaway here is that the best way to fight back against politicians who are trying to whitewash history is by simply teaching history. It's really unfortunate that Florida educators are going to have to deal with these bizarre and, quite frankly, racist academic standards in the upcoming school year, but hopefully I've given them at least a few ideas as to how they can engage in malicious compliance. It's very obvious that a lot of these standards are deeply steeped in white supremacist ideology, so with a little creativity, these teachers can say the words they're required to say, but then immediately undercut them by using historical examples, and hopefully give their students a more thorough understanding of the African American experience. If any of you happen to know any Florida educators who are troubled by these new standards, please do send them this video, as I hope it can provide them a little bit of inspiration as to how they might want to handle these issues in their classrooms. But even if you're not a teacher, you might end up having to educate someone down the road, so keep this in your back pocket and think about it.